I can't do a good evil laugh, but if I could, I'd be doing it right now, just kind of sitting there with my fingers together, just thinking of how many people are going to get headaches from watching this video. I'm just kidding, partially. Transport zones are one of those topics within NSXT that always gives people a really hard time. It took me a very long time to understand it. The good news is I think I can make it really simple for you guys. So let's start with a couple of just conceptual discussion around what a transport zone is and why we have it. Then, as usual, we're going to get into the GUI and actually look at transport zones in practice. So let's get to it. All right, so as usual, we have our ESX host. In this case, we have two ESX hosts, and we have some VMs sitting on top of them. Now, we create what's called a transport zone, and when we create a transport zone, we define a type. It can either be an overlay transport zone or a VLAN transport zone. And basically the way it goes is if it's an overlay transport zone, it can only have overlay network segments tied to it. And if it's VLAN, it can only have VLAN segments tied to it. So we're going to now create a segment. We'll create a web overlay segment. This is a network where we have an IP address and the whole 9 yards. Now we tie that to a transport zone. At this point, we haven't really done much. Now, once we connect that transport zone, just like I did here, to a host, or once we add that transport zone to the host, here's where the magic happens. Now that WebSeg is available to that host. So basically you can think about it like this. You tie a bunch of network segments to a transport zone, and whichever hosts have that transport zone on them, they will have access to that network. And what I mean by saying they'll have access, I mean these VMs here will actually be able to go into edit settings and they'll be able to select this web segment. So let's take that a step further. Let's create another segment now that we already have a transport zone created. I create this app overlay segment, I connect it to the transport zone. Because the host is already added to the transport zone, that segment automatically appears here. This would basically continue. If I added another segment, it would automatically populate and now those VMs could use it. Just the same if we had another transport zone, let's say maybe that was our prod transport zone and now we want to have a test environment. And maybe the whole point is this. I'm a test engineer or a developer or something like that, and I don't want these VMs to accidentally be connected to a prod network. I don't want someone to accidentally connect this VM to web segment or app segment. But I do want it to be connected to something, and I want to maintain some kind of separation, maybe just, if for nothing else, to keep things neat. So I create this test overlay transport zone. I create a couple of segments. Again, these are overlay segments. I call it web-test and db-test. I tie those to the transport zone, and now I add that host to that transport zone, and you probably know what happens next. Just like magic, now that the host is added to the transport zone, we have access to those networks, but notice we don't have access to connect this VM right here to any of these segments, and the only reason is because I have not added this host to that transport zone. So one of the big use cases that I've seen is that people will do this so that they can maintain separation maybe between a dev and test environment or prod and non-prod. That said, just because these are separate transport zones does not on its own mean that they can't communicate between the two. So don't think of it as a security boundary, it's more of almost an administrative boundary. So let's look at this in practice. So here we are back in NSXT Manager. I'll show you guys how to get here from the main page. So I go to System and Fabric, I expand that out, and I go down to Transport Zones. So here by default, in my lab, I've created a couple of extras, and you'll see I have, in this case, MG Edge VLAN TZ, and I have, it's a VLAN type of transport zone, and then this one's an overlay type. And keep in mind, that means if I create an overlay segment, I can only attach it to an overlay transport zone. The two have to agree. And you remember how I said that we have to add a host to the transport zone? Well, look right here where we see transport zone members, or transport node members rather. If I click on this one, it says 3. I see that I have my two ESX hosts have been added to this transport zone, and I also see my edge node. And we're going to come back, I have a whole section dedicated to the edge piece, but this is an important piece because remember the edge is the on-off ramp. So it's going to take all of the traffic from the host, all of the overlay traffic, it's going to decapsulate it, and it's going to send it onto the network as just a regular network packet. So that's why the edge has to be a member of the overlay transport zone as well. So I'm going to close out of that. And I want to point out one thing, and you see here this little default tag. So these two transport zones are in NSXT by default. So I could absolutely use these. I didn't actually have to create this one. I could have just used this overlay transport zone by default. I just chose not to. Now let me show you how we actually add a host to a transport zone. So if I go to nodes, and let's see, we can use one of the nodes we've been using. So I'll do 254.11. If I go to configure NSX, and I go to next, you see right here it says transport zone, MG overlay TZ, and NSX VLAN transport zone. And if I select this dropdown, I have all these other options. So that's how you add the host to the transport zone. So what this is essentially telling me is that any networks connected to this transport zone or to this transport zone, I will see on this host specifically. So let's kind of drive that point home. So keep in mind, let's remember, how about we remember this one, NSX VLAN transport zone. Let's keep that in mind. So I'm going to cancel out, I'm not making any changes, just remember NSX VLAN transport zone. I'm going to go over to the network tab and I'm going to create a segment, and don't worry, we're going to do all of this from scratch. I just want to make this point clear. I think it'll help. So I'm going to hit add segment, and I'm just going to create a VLAN, I'll call it VL500 seg. So it's just a segment I'm creating. It's not connected to anything. It's actually just a VLAN backed network. So this is not overlay networking or anything like that. And I'll select the proper transport zones. You see here I have all these options. So in this case, I'm going to select that, and I'm going to give it the VLAN ID. So any traffic connected to this segment will basically be tagged for VLAN 500. It's kind of like a port group in vSphere is basically what I'm doing. So I hit save there. I'm going to go here. I don't want to configure anything further for that one. And now while we're doing that, let's also do another one just to kind of prove our point. So I'm going to create another one. We'll call this VLAN 501-seg. And I'm going to purposely put this on the wrong segment. I'll put it on this one. Keep in mind that host did not have this segment, this transport zone right here. It only had this transport zone and the overlay transport zone. So I'm going to select the wrong one on purpose, and I'm going to do everything else the right way. That's 501. I'm going to hit save, and let's go to our host and let's see what we're actually seeing on that host. Let's see which segments are actually showing up. So if we go here and I go back out of here and we check our networks, we can see right, there we go. So we have VLAN 500-seg. Now remember, why is that here? If we look at hosts, we can see it's 254.11. So that host now has access to that network. Just to prove my point even further, let's find a VM on that host. Let's find which VMs are on this host first. So we'll do VM-pink. How about that? So this VM is on that host. So I'm going to go edit the network, and we're going to try to assign it to VLAN 500. And it's right there. But notice what's missing. Remember, I put VLAN 501-seg on the wrong transport zone. As a result, it's not going to show up here anytime soon. And the reason is just comes back to that core concept that it has to be on the proper transport zone, and the transport zone has to be added to the proper host. So just to kind of summarize things, the transport zone is doing nothing more than defining the span of these logical segments. So when we create them, it's just saying how far can that reach, which host can I access that network from. It's not a security boundary though, so we're not talking about filtering traffic. We're strictly talking about, as you saw a minute ago, which networks can I connect those VMs to. If the transport zone is not configured properly, well then I can't even see that network in vCenter. There are two types. There's the overlay type and the VLAN backed. Now remember that they have to agree. So I can't create, say, an overlay network and assign it to a VLAN transport zone. That just won't work. It'll give me an error. So the two have to be consistent, and that's why the default has the overlay and a VLAN transport zone by default. So you have one of each, and you can create as many as you need. Very simple to do that, and we'll have a video dedicated to actually starting that from scratch.